First of all, it's great to be on the show with all of you and all that and all these things. I love it. And if you enjoy listening to The Edge, subscribe to The Edge on iTunes, the Stitcher, and you can totally listen to it on iHeartRadio.
This is The Edge with Mark Thompson.
Oh, it's good to have you here. And this is a cool show. There is a lot going on in this show. Okay, so Michael Shure joins us. And we're going to talk about the move of the American Embassy to Jerusalem, but not in a way that everybody else is talking about it, in a way that Michael has firsthand knowledge of, which is through the state of Arkansas. We'll talk about that in just a few moments. Then it's the Manson family, not the Manson family that perpetrated the crime. The actual family of Charles Manson is filled with an intriguing story that is now being documented by our guest. And our guest is a documentarian who has produced television shows about the supernatural, but he doesn't come from that world per se. He's sort of a cynical intellect, yet he finds himself documenting a lot of things that produce remarkable stories. Robin Keats is his name, and he joins us for a bulk of the show today. J. Elvis Weinstein will join us with Robin, and J. Elvis's new movie is out, and we'll tell you about that. Some of you have dropped us some emails. It was Steve who said on the call-in part of the show last time, when a call-in guest has an S phone, the guy bitching about the schools, please ask him to get a different phone. Okay, noted. And next time, we won't do that. We were on the fence about using that, but we felt he had a lot of good things to say. Still, yes, his phone line was bad. You'll be glad to know, Steve, there are no phones on this show. Everyone is in studio. Thank you for all the ways you support the show. I say it every week, but there are those of you who hit our virtual tip jar on PayPal. If you go to our website, edge-show.com, there's a PayPal link. You guys are so terrific. Thank you. It means so much. All the money stays with the show. We pay webmasters, we pay producers. We try to keep the show lean, but we just have costs, and it helps keep the lights on. The show runs in the red, but it helps defray our costs. So thank you, all of you who have left us anything through the PayPal link. And if you click on any episode at edge-show.com, I know many of you listen on iTunes or on Stitcher, but if you go to our parent website before you shop at Amazon, you can click on the Amazon link on our page, and that takes you through to the regular Amazon. It's just like the Amazon you normally shop, but we get a little piece of whatever you spend. We don't see what you spend. We don't have any idea who you are, but they spin off a little piece because you came through our website, edge-show.com. Please subscribe, please share, please give us the 5-star ratings. It matters in the iTunes universe particularly. You can hear the show on YouTube now. You can subscribe there. iTunes, Stitcher, Overcast, and iHeartRadio. Thank you for being here. Let's get started.
This is The Edge.
The advantage, it means.
They let guys just spit on me for no reason.
That's horrible.
Is there some comfort in uncertainty, do you think?
You're a degenerate.
Because Australian Shepherds need action.
Wow. Yeah.
This is The Edge.
That's a self-loathing term that I use.
Oh, got it.
Back from the road, you love him. He is Michael Shure, everybody. Michael Shure. Michael Shure.
Thank you. Thank you. It took them a second to remember who I was, and I'm glad that they finally did.
We've had a huge technical error, and I just would share it with the audience. We've essentially completed an entire conversation with Michael Shure, and it was really good. And then I looked down, and none of it was recorded. Michael Shure just got back from Arkansas, and you may be saying, what does Arkansas have to do with the move to Jerusalem of the American Embassy in Israel? And the truth is, it is a great window on something that's key in that move.
Yeah, I mean, you can draw a straight line from evangelical Christians in northwest Arkansas to the embassy moving from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. I mean, it's not even a complicated story.
Your story, which you did for I-24,
yeah,
you give us a profile of it's a mega church.
Right, it is. It's the fifth largest, Arkansas is the fifth largest evangelical state, and this is maybe, I think, the 11th largest church in the country. The pastor there, his name is Ronnie Floyd, and he's a master wordsmith and a true believer in evangelical Christian values, in revelations, and etc., all of that. And it was, like you said, it was a real window. My network covers the Mideast. They're based in Tel Aviv. We're not on the air in Israel. We're based in Tel Aviv, New York, D.C., and Paris, and we cover stories that affect the Middle East. So this has been a sort of a Super Bowl Sunday, May 14th was, because they knew that was the day the embassy was moving. When I suggested I go to Arkansas or someplace like it, a few people said, well, Arkansas, what does that have to do with? Well, it has everything to do with it. Maybe it's the place where everybody should go if they want to know why this embassy moved. And I think people now understand that because of the reporting that we were able to do there. We didn't break a story, but we did provide a point of view and a window, like you said.
Well, here's what I couldn't believe. I always thought that these pockets of evangelical Christians were dotted all across the area like Arkansas. But
Right.
I didn't think that they were organized on the level that they clearly are. Your piece really shows these huge collections of people in mega churches of the sort that you've described who are changing political history.
No, absolutely. I mean, these are people that had the effect of becoming a voting bloc that any candidate wants to woo. Donald Trump was a difficult seductor for them because of all the baggage that he brings that is clearly on paper anti-Christian, and you can argue what that means, but would go against most evangelicals who didn't like divorced presidents, who didn't like, philandering people, et cetera, et cetera. This is the wrong guy for them, but this was the right guy for them because of what he was able to do for them. He was able to give them a Supreme Court justice, presumably when Roe v. Wade comes up, should it ever come up before them, would vote the way they want him to vote, which is in a pro-life way. And he moved the embassy in Israel, which provides greater security in their eyes and greater future for Israel to be protected, not because they love Jews in Israel so much, but because they need that place where their Lord is going to come back and return to be safe and secure.
Here's one of the people you spoke with.
Professor Matt Evans sees the embassy move as another deal for Trump.
This is one piece of a larger menu, including the Supreme Court, that he's delivering for evangelical Christians. So yes, it is very much a quid pro quo.
That's exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, you may not love this guy, but he's going to give you what you want now, and he is the way to do that. Oh, and by the way, Mike Pence is running with him, and Mike Pence is an evangelical, and if he can do it, so can you.
Yeah, and Mike Pence raised evangelicals to a level of power that they've never really held prior to this.
Right, definitely the highest-ranking evangelical Christian in our history, and certainly in our modern history. I don't know if evangelical was a word that they used in the 1800s and 1700s. I'm sure they did, but it was a different kind of evangelical.
Here is the other part of evangelical Christians that is also covered in your piece.
But for believers on a May Sunday in Arkansas, the subject of Israel was not about transactional politics.
That we're making a statement that this is the holy city, this is the place, and we support you, Israel, we support you, Jerusalem.
Bob Costrell, a professor at the University of Arkansas and an AIPAC leader in this state, is refreshed by evangelical support for Israel.
It seems a natural alliance, coming from different places, but working together for the same goal, which is the security of the state of Israel.
But where that support comes from has raised skepticism from some who feel that American evangelicals want the embassy move only to secure the place where they believe Jesus Christ will return.
But obviously there are many today that believe that there is a prophetic fulfillment that must occur in relationship toward that and kicking into that eternal calendar that will one day lead all to the end battle of the Battle at Armageddon.
Now, the Battle of Armageddon does not sound fun.
No, it doesn't. It's
I'm really hoping I'm away that day. But it's apparently it's not the Battle of Armageddon that we look forward to. It's the time after the Battle of Armageddon.
The new millennium where where Christ will come and everyone will follow him regardless of their origins because they will follow him. And if they don't, they will be banished to hell.
Well, if he comes back, I will be following. I mean, I will be there. You won't need to send a car for me because
you'll be blown away by it.
It's not going to happen. But if it does happen, believe me, I want to announce this, Christians, don't worry about me. I'll be right there shoulder to shoulder with you.
This would blow away the rabbit out of the hat.
Wow.
Yeah.
According to their scripture, this end time or rapture involves the conversion of all in order to find salvation. Cross Church's teaching pastor Jeff Crawford knows the role that Israel plays.
Our belief that God's going to finish working through Israel is the belief that Jews, even Muslims, Palestinians, there's going to be a great move towards the end of time of many people coming to Christ, recognizing him as the Messiah.
Evangelicals were unquestionably important to moving an embassy in Israel, but it's because there's no questioning Israel's importance to evangelicals.
And it was through the Jewish people, through a Jew named Jesus, that I now have access to the throne of God and the kingdom of God in heaven.
In a nutshell, that's the whole story with Israel, Jerusalem, the embassy move, and evangelicals and politics in America.
Right. That's exactly it. And this is not the separation of church and state, really, because this is church telling state that we will support you, state, as long as you support what we want, and state saying, okay, we will. Now, of course, Supreme Court justice is a different thing. You name a justice who agrees with your political ideology normally. Democrats are going to give you what Democrats will give you, and Republicans the same, with some exceptions and some surprises. But this type of initiation comes from a direct appeal to very, very religious Americans. And that appeal was needed for those candidates.
I didn't think that constituency you're talking about, the evangelical Christians, had the kind of political clout that they clearly have.
Yeah, they do. I mean, obviously, a lot of people misidentify Iowa as a very evangelical state, but it's the first place that you do have to appeal to evangelicals. And Trump had a difficult time. Ted Cruz got their votes in the primaries, but when he went back as the candidate, people started coming into the fold for Donald Trump because they knew, first of all, when he had Mike Pence's name on his ticket,
that was his
that was a stamp of approval. Yep, yeah. That is exactly right. That's like, well, if he can do it, I can do it.
I mean, they really have had to hold their nose through a lot of stuff with Trump.
They do, and there's a spinelessness about it in the eyes of many because they say, well, are you really Christians? How do you countenance this man who is, with porn stars and speaking about women in this way? At the end of the day, it's about the end of the time, right? And the end of time is much more important. Protecting what they have in their scripture is much more important to them. They can, like you said, hold their noses and get this done. And if Mike Pence could do it, again, I don't want to understate the importance of that was a real stamp of approval that they looked for.
Mike Pence is beginning to reconstitute himself within the White House, as you're aware, and within the politics of the Republican Party, particularly here at the midterms, in ways that I think for certain White House staffers, they're not so excited.
No, that's true. And for certain Republicans, and you go to many Republicans, actually, elected Republicans, who think that brand of politics hurts the Republican brand as a whole.
And what does that mean, that brand of politics?
Well, the very religious, the very right-wing religious politics that are informed biblically, Republicans think you lose too much by making that too big of a score, which is why it's sort of almost fluky that an evangelical went this far, and the fact that he did by tying himself to Donald Trump is incredible to a lot of Republicans. You talked about White House staffers being upset by it. One of the least popular people from Trump world to a generation of Trump White House staffers was Corey Lewandowski. I mean, they had a very difficult time with him. Well, Corey Lewandowski is now going to be working with Mike Pence. And so it's a problem within that world. They seem to overcome them, but you can't overcome them forever.
Well, you mentioned Corey Lewandowski. I mean, Corey Lewandowski is a perfect example of what we're talking about because Corey Lewandowski...
He was reputedly had a relationship with Hope Hicks. He's a married man, which is, of course, not something that they endorse, though they always forgive their pastors who go down that road. So there's a great deal of hypocrisy that comes out of the evangelical church in that way. And Corey Lewandowski was someone who manhandled people, and including women, members of the press during the campaign, and who had battles with other people in Trump's world. And so, there's just a great deal of hypocrisy, and it's never more pronounced than it is with the evangelical church.
Well, you mentioned the midterms, and you mentioned you didn't mention the primaries, but I'll mention them. If you're a progressive, should you be encouraged? There was some big news out of the primaries.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think you look at Carrie Eastman in Nebraska's 2nd District, barely vanquishing Brad Ashford, a former Democratic congressman who was making a return there. And the fact that she won in the state of Nebraska on Medicare for All, that was her signature issue there. That's a progressive issue. That's fantastic. And progressives, they haven't done very well in these elections recently, but they are making a mark, and you get a win like that. It's hard to do. It's hard to change things. It takes a long time, and these are people who they're younger, their life has been about instant gratification. You don't like this job, you go to another job. You don't like this city, you go to another city. They're very, very fickle. But it takes a while, and they've made incredible strides to this point to get where they are and to get people. I think that was a great effect of Bernie Sanders. And listen, their big candidate in Pennsylvania congressional race, Greg Edwards, who was supported, a black pastor supported by Bernie Sanders, came in third. But he did well, and it's hard. It's really hard, but they are making their mark, and I think that's important, and they should not stop. And just because they lost in a Virginia governor's primary, and just because their guy didn't win in every state, that doesn't mean that this is a lost cause. This is actually a very found cause.
It's funny when you talk about that, losing but gaining ground and getting a legitimacy to certain issues that have been orphaned through the years. There is a sense that Rome is burning and that we need to put out the fire now. And that's what sort of mitigates against what you're talking about, sort of being okay with incremental progress.
Well, but that sense exists within many people who don't think their way is the right way of going about fixing it, right? I mean, there are great Democrats who agree with the progressives that the world is on fire, that think that the way to put that fire out is to elect Democrats, get the majorities, and make some changes and have those committee chairs. They're not going to get that overnight either. If they get a Democratic House and or a Democratic Senate, those problems aren't going to go away overnight, but there's going to be a calming of the storm, which is the kind of politics that a lot of Democrats like. As the progressive politics start infusing that, it's going to make the change. But the fire isn't going to go away overnight, and not everybody sees the progressive way as the way to put that fire out.
I've been told you have a new show. Can we talk about it?
We can talk about it. It's called Reasonably Sure. It's not on the Young Turks Network just yet. It will be on. It'll be a weekly show. It'll be an interview with somebody very interesting, talking about their lives. It'll be biographical, but it will also be no. That was a terrible way for me to say. I'm very excited about it, actually. But what I mean, it's going to be an interview show. When you're talking about other people's lives, talking about issues, I don't have a start date for it.
I see. So you're exasperated because you don't quite have all the info on it.
I don't have all the info. No, but I'm not my exasperation was misread. I'm actually very excited. I'm not even the slightest bit exasperated. I'm excited about it.
I think you're totally exasperated, and I don't get any excitement.
I'm exasperated with this
I don't blame it for being exasperated today.
This podcast that did we get this? Or is this on?
Awful.
Have we recorded this?
I agree. And look, you're right to be annoyed. We've had a good, but I will say this: you're right to be annoyed. I am sorry, and it will not happen again.
And I'm not annoyed. You're a friend, and a mistake happened, and it's fine.
All right, Michael. Anything before we leave? Anything not related to politics? You saw that the median age on television is now, I think it's north of 50.
Yeah.
I mean, people aren't watching TV anymore, who are the new generation. Your son is 13. Does he watch television?
He watches sports on television.
Right. He doesn't watch any series?
He doesn't watch any series.
Nothing. Not even no comedy, nothing?
Well, he watches The Simpsons. He records and watches The Simpsons.
Oh, that's cool.
He likes The Simpsons. But there's not, a sitcom, forget it. Nothing like that. I should say that that's not true. He doesn't watch with me. He watches with his mother, and they record some shows that are like Hawaii Five-0. He watched. He loved Hawaii Five-0.
Yeah,
but not recently.
Michael, you've done the Lord's work, as we say in Arkansas, and thank you.
You're the best.
See you at Armageddon. Michael Shure, everybody. Yes.
If you enjoy listening to The Edge, support them by subscribing to The Edge on iTunes, Stitcher, and you can listen through the iHeartRadio app. Get busy listening.
Get more of The Edge on Stitcher and iTunes, or go to our website, edge-show.com.
And now get ready for a lot of different subject matter. The Manson family, documentary filmmaking, ghosts, Robin Keats. But we start with a mic check.
I will speak like this.
5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
You know, I have a hearing deficit on my right side because of Meniere's disease, which is the same thing that Huey Lewis is now dealing with. In fact, he just canceled a big tour. And you're probably saying, why am I mentioning this? Because when you counted to 10, it reminded me of a test they do for your hearing. Because there are two basic tests that they do. There may be a bunch of tests within that, but one of them's for what frequencies you can hear. That's why they give you a tone. Mm-hmm. And then there's what can you hear in terms of distinguishing words. And so you have a guy who sounds like Robin, sounds like our guest, saying things like, say the word brick, say the word dead. And that, by the way, and of course, because I'm sort of a dark mind, all the words connote like just darkness and doom.
It's a Rorschach test for you.
Say the word sick. Say the words months to live.
Say decay.
Right. So when you were counting 1, 2, 3, it reminded me of that voice. You have the same timbre. Our guest, Robin Keats, welcome. You are someone who's done a lot. And I don't even know where to begin, but you're a documentary filmmaker, a television producer, a columnist, a publisher. You're here with J. Elvis Weinstein, who himself a writer, comedy writer, comedian, and documentary filmmaker. And I like to get it out of the way up front, Robin. Josh has a newly released film, documentary film. Josh, where can...
Why, it's true, Mark.
And where can people hear it, see it, be part of it? How can people luxuriate in this new release?
They can go to, first of all, it's called I Need You to Kill. It's about stand-up comedy in Asia, and you can find it on iTunes, Google Play, Amazon for rent or for purchase. Features Tom Segura, hilarious guy.
It features American comics over there.
Few American comics on tour over there, and then it explores these burgeoning comedy scenes. It's very funny.
Yeah, it is funny, and then they go on their own little journey, and I enjoyed it a lot.
Also, in a lot of ways, sort of my little love letter to stand-up comedy in general.
I Need You to Kill is what it's called. Robin, you have a connection to comedy.
I do. Aside from thinking I was possibly funny when I got to college, I walked into a dormitory room and was immediately approached by my new roommate who had asked me what I wanted to do when I got out of college. And I was already writing for newspapers by the time I got to college. And I said I wanted to be a writer. And I asked him what he wanted to do. And he was quite specific in his answer. He said, I want to be the host of The Tonight Show. It wasn't that I want to just be a comedian or I want to be the host of a late night show. It was The Tonight Show. And his name was Jay Leno. So I have never forgotten that focus. And he also told me at the time that wasn't concerned about getting married at the time. Didn't want to have a goldfish, nothing to get in his way. He was just absolutely focused on that goal.
Also, I'm taking the top bunk.
Yeah.
But, it's funny, just on Jay Leno for a second, because he really did establish comedy chops more than even hosting TV chops early.
Absolutely, but he obviously knew that was the path.
Yeah, but I mean, if he had stopped just at being a comedian, he would be one of the great comedians.
Yes, in fact, it might have helped his legacy as a great comedian.
Well, because you feel as though he had to water himself down when
Absolutely.
he got there.
He was, in fact, I think, one of the great stand-ups. And I feel like he compromised some of that for hostdom.
Yeah, I see that. I'm sure that. But when he was your roommate, did you go see him perform? Was he performing in clubs? He must have been.
He started right away with another fellow in the dorm named Gene Braunstein, and they were Jay and Gene. Gene later came out to L.A. and was producing sitcoms and writing for sitcoms. He was funny from the moment I met him. It's funnier before that, I'm sure. He had been an accounting student at Bentley College.
Jay had or Gene had?
Jay had, and had spent a year there. Obviously, accounting wasn't for him, so he made the transfer to Emerson College, which was much more of an environment for comedy and for communications. Now, he went right away and started to play in the dorms and then in the combat zone, which was Boston's red light district at the time. So he was playing the strip clubs and then going to class, or going to class and going to the strip clubs and playing and doing comedy.
I was doing the same.
That was his life.
My year in college.
Is that right? You had a similar kind of...
I started when I was 15 doing stand-up, so I was going to high school and going to clubs at night, too.
You didn't have that Tonight Show goal, though, did you?
I did not, no.
Yeah.
I thought I wanted to be on it,
but
that never happened.
Well,
and the other snarky comments about Jay Leno probably didn't help my case, but...
Jay, maybe when you stop watering down your act to become commercially viable, you'll be able to book me. But you're working on a documentary yourself, Robin. It involves the Manson family.
Yes.
Charles Manson's family.
But the actual Manson family, it sounds like, not the Manson family.
Exactly. This is about his genetic family, his real-life blood-related family.
Not the people who call themselves the Manson family who perpetrated the horrible crimes of murder and...
Well, a number of them have been contacted for future interviews as we go through production. But this is more about his grandson, which is a fellow named Jason Freeman, and his search for his roots. And it turns out he has been in touch with his grandfather, or was in touch with his grandfather for about 5 years of telephone recordings. They never got to meet in person while alive. But there was a couple of court cases to establish the genetic relationship and that he could control what happened to Charles after death. And we just recently filmed the funeral.
The actual Manson family that you described, the genetic family, that's a fascinating family because there's abandonment, there are all these issues that sort of foreshadow something, potentially. And I wonder if you can discuss that. Like, who are the actual Manson family members, the genetic family?
Right. Well, his main link to this was his dad, Charles Manson's son, Charles Manson Jr., who committed suicide in the early 90s, could not handle being Manson's son. At least that's what the headlines for the newspapers blared out. A man can't handle knowing who his dad was, and in his 40s took his own life.
Was that corroborated by any other family members? That is to say, yeah, he was haunted by this name? Yeah.
Yeah. So his grandson, Jason, really never got to spend a lot of time, knew his dad, but there wasn't much contact there. And he had been haunted by the family name throughout his childhood. He knew that he was related, but it was also kept, let's keep this quiet, who wants to draw that kind of attention? So through his life, I had noticed that there's a history of abandonment. Charles Manson himself was abandoned by his mom, and there was a whole series of different dads or men in his life.
Now, what does that mean, abandoned by his mom? Abandoned by his mom like Moses was abandoned? And when and how?
Yeah, nearly. From what we can ascertain, there were times when she would come in and out of his life through his first few years, but she was continuously being arrested as well. So she would be serving time in jail or was off with another man, not Charles Manson's father.
What kind of stuff was she arrested for?
I believe burglary, armed robbery. I'd have to double check that, but enough to put her at Moundsville State Penitentiary in West Virginia, which is a notoriously horrendous place.
Wow, she was really in a penitentiary.
Yeah.
And was there a father of record for him?
There is well, the father of record is Charles Manson, and he's got the adoption papers also because his mother later remarried. His father adopted him, but the bloodline was established. And after Charles Manson died, there were a number of people who came forward and said that we have his will, or we're the ones. There is another stepson, meaning it is Manson's son. We're not sure who the mother was. He had contested, but they had found that Jason Freeman had done all the proper paperwork, all the correct things, and is the heir to Manson's legacy, whatever that might be. And that legacy is one of abandonment. I think my role in this, because it's, the documentary isn't mine. I'm working, for a production company that's got the rights. I had first stumbled across the story quite a few years ago. And with the attention to Manson when he got sick earlier in this year, then things started to roll about, let's do a documentary on this. I had come across working for a show called Ghost Stories back in 2009. I was producing that and went down to Moundsville State Penitentiary in West Virginia. It had been closed by that time, but had notorious stories of hauntings. And I noticed on the wall a framed handwritten letter. I took a closer look at it, and it was a letter from Charles Manson in his handwriting from Vacaville State Prison in California, written to the warden at Moundsville, asking if he could help him transfer from California to West Virginia so he could serve the rest of his term, which was life, in the same cell that his mother had occupied there. And that just sent chills down my spine. I thought, this is an interesting story, and that this whole project kind of grew out of that over a number of years.
What a great play that would make if they had granted that request. Like a Beckett play.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it suggests an unresolved coupling that he wanted with his mother, right?
Very much so, to the point where when the mother finally got released and Charles Manson was a little boy, and this going back, I think, into the early 50s, she came out, and Charles, I think, was a little kid. I don't know if he was 4 or 6 years old, but at the time he ran up to his mom, as the story goes, thrilled to have his mom back. She gave him a hug and promptly got in a car with some other man and just drove off. And he was left in the care of some notorious criminals throughout his life. So it was a story of abandonment. And what struck me was the story of Manson's crimes, alleged crimes. I mean, he was put in jail for murder, although he himself did not kill any of those people, is one of abandonment, because he was abandoned. And I can't say that the whole blame for Charles Manson's legacy is because he had been abandoned, but it certainly had a major influence on his life. And then his son abandoned his grandson by committing suicide. Now the grandson's left wondering about what his roots are, what this name means to him, and he's got sons of his own. So this documentary is the idea of let's explore the roots and let's break this pattern of multi-generational abandonment so that I could be the good dad that I should be and learn from the lessons of history rather than repeat them.
That's what his grandson is saying.
Yep.
And so how deep a relationship did he form with Manson Sr. when he was alive?
Well, to listen to some of the tapes are harrowing because he could either be quite warm or incredibly cold.
Again, these are tapes of telephone conversations between him and his grandfather.
Yes, over the past 5 years. And there were times when he said, I could be a real hard mother. And, he never gave him permission to see him in person at the prison. He denied him permission. And I thought from the very beginning that the major moment of the documentary would be when he actually saw his grandfather, came face to face, and I had the feeling it would be in the casket. And that's how it played out.
He wouldn't grant it. Was it one of those things that he kept saying, we'll do it next month, or he just said, I'm just not comfortable with it?
He kept saying, move out to California, move your family out to California, be closer. As it turns out, quite a number, and we don't know exactly how many, but a number of the former Manson family members or associates have all moved back to the Corcoran State Prison area. One in particular is one named Sandra Good. Sandra Good was one of the Manson girls, but not one who was arrested for that crime spree in L.A. She was arrested, I think on the same day, for sending threatening letters to heads of corporations that pollute. And it was charged with the U.S. mail, abusing the U.S. mail system to make threats. They sentenced her, I believe, to 15 years in jail. She served 10, and I believe in Vermont, because it was not to be served here. Part of her sentence was, or part of what the courts told her was, you cannot come back anywhere near Charles Manson for 20 years. It took 20 years, and then she moved back to the Corcoran area.
Right.
So there is a pull, a strange, unusual pull of former Manson associates to still go and visit him and live in the area and be able to have visitation, which is...
That's frightening.
Yeah,
that is really eerie.
Well, I mean, you see that with, you see it with other cult leaders too, like the Bhagwan, that in the wild country thing, that he still has his adherents that followed him back to India, and he still, there's still... Once you believe, it's almost like if you're a true believer, you believe all this other stuff is just testing your faith.
Yeah.
No, that's probably a decent point on that. Yeah, it seems remarkable. How did you wade through all of the conversations, the telephone conversations, and somehow marry them to a narrative with this Manson grandson?
Right. We're still in the process of doing that, but in giving the background of how their relationship started, which was, he had written him quite a number of letters. There are Facebook groups dedicated to Charles Manson around the country. There's one fellow in Boston that's got a group of about 2,000, and when I marveled at the idea that there could be 2,000 people supporting Manson on a Facebook group, he said, that's just one of several. There are supporters of Manson from all over the world.
My wife is fascinated with all of it. Obviously, she's not a follower or supporter of Manson, but she's absolutely fascinated by the story. I think because she grew up here in L.A., and some in the 70s, and I think it's not that hard for her to picture her. She related to some of those girls, I think.
Oh, I see.
And so I think that's part of burrowed into her head is sort of a there but for the grace of God go I sort of thing.
There's something about the story, it's so dark and there's such infamy associated with him that you see how it gets this sort of cult of interest around it, even if it's not, some kind of cult of devotion. It might just be that, an interest. So what's your schedule on the release of that film?
Well, we just put together the, called, if it wasn't just pure television, a sizzle reel, but a promo piece. Distributors have just been lined up. The deals are almost closed now for international distribution. And once the rest of that money comes in, we'll finish shooting. We've shot maybe 6 different segments that were at Spahn Ranch, approaching Corcoran Prison to try to get the grandson in to see his grandfather.
Spahn Ranch is where a lot of them lived.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Then the funeral.
You attended the funeral with cameras?
I was supposed to. I set up the whole funeral and kept it very, very quiet.
You produced the funeral?
I suppose I produced the funeral. And we also took an X-ray of the body. It's almost a keepsake. To me, it was almost kind of akin. It's an awful thing to say, but it's not akin to the Shroud of Turin, but the idea of having the skeletal remains or an image of a body that's no longer on Earth.
Sure.
To have that.
Well, and the body was kept intact after he died?
The body was put on ice by Kern County, which is where Bakersfield is, which is where the hospital he was sent to. He had died, I believe, of colon cancer.
Okay.
That he had suffered for a while. So they kept it from November up until close into March.
And was it hard to find a cemetery?
Well, it was a cremation.
Okay.
It was difficult to find a crematorium funeral home that would keep this quiet because we did not want a media show on this. We're really treating the subject very respectfully. We're not looking to make it glorified or sensationalized. We really want to tell the story of this man's journey, the grandson's journey. It is quite unique. And to handle it respectfully, we wanted to keep the likes of TMZ and Inquirer, various Inside Edition. We got all kinds of requests to attend the funeral. So I kind of did it on a very sub rosa level and chose a funeral home outside of Bakersfield, kept it all very quiet, and it was successful that we were able to keep it quiet.
How many people attended his funeral?
About 12.
Okay.
About 12.
Wow, it really is. You think about it, it's an extraordinarily tough thing to do, isn't it?
Yeah.
How do you ensure that the funeral home, that those connected to the proceedings, that every link in the chain, if you will, does respect the privacy and the low-key nature of the whole endeavor?
Well, I vetted a number of places in Bakersfield.
And how do you vet them, though?
Yeah, well, it was definitely an unusual assignment. In calling them up, I would first say, we're interested in having a funeral conducted, but very, very quietly and away from the media. And I think every funeral home in Bakersfield had probably been on the alert. I'm sure that TMZ and Inside Edition and various other kinds of shows had been in touch with them or had been on stakeout, because we had noticed earlier when we were filming last summer that people were following us. So it was so much in the news, and I guess it's such a story. If it bleeds, it leads. Well, this is the ultimate if it bleeds, it leads story. And to
50
do that,
years of bleeding and leading.
Yeah. It was quite a build-up. So once I started to get the feeling that the places in Bakersfield were all going to know who it was I was talking about, I figured that we should switch somewhere outside the city. And the grandson is quite religious. So I looked for ones that seemed to have more of a religious affiliation and then put those two in contact. So it was the idea of, let's do this on a really, literally good faith basis. And with the X-ray, I never said who it was. I used a different name in case they wanted to look me up on IMDb and see my credits and then say, I'll put two and two together. This must be about Manson. So there was no guarantee, but we flew under the radar.
And what denomination was his funeral?
It wasn't. It was just an ecumenical, non-denominational, but Christian. And the ashes were scattered instead of a burial, because we certainly didn't want a site that would become a martyred.
I think that's what Josh was sort of hinting at when we began this, was sort of like what cemetery would even entertain the notion of his remains being buried there, because it's going to become this
site.
Yeah, exactly. Wow, what a journey, huh? I'll bet you didn't think you were going to, find yourself on that journey.
I had been a poetry major. I never expected in a million years to be doing Charles Manson. But then again, I've run into a lot of different crazy assignments in my career as a writer or producer that I never would imagine I'd be meeting these people.
You did and do produce a lot of these ghost shows, where it's like the ghosts of, I'm just picking stuff out, but the ghosts of rock and roll, the ghosts of railroads, the ghosts of, they have all these different ghost shows, right? And now tell me what some of them are literally.
Well, it's a phenomenon that's still sometimes hard for me to grasp. The leading one is one I'm doing some work for right now, which is called Ghost Adventures, which is on Travel Channel. It's their #1 show, and it has been since its inception, I think, in 2008. And I got to that. It's the same company that's producing the Manson documentary, My Entertainment, out of New York. Another former college roommate of mine. And he had remembered me in college from being very wrapped up with the Carlos Castaneda books.
Oh, sure.
Don Juan, A Yaqui Way
that
of
was
Knowledge.
the whole mescaline thing.
Yeah.
Magical realism.
Magical realism. And when Leno called me, I went to work for magazines right after college. I graduated from Emerson College in Boston and lucked out that I got a job at the New Yorker magazine within a few months. And from New Yorker, I went on to Esquire and to GQ. And I got a call from Leno, who had gone out to L.A. by that time. This is in the late 70s, and said, you really ought to get out of magazines and get into television. There's a lot more money.
So Leno, to his credit, wasn't just focused on the Tonight Show. He was trying to do you a solid and give you some career advice.
Yeah.
There's no money in poetry. What the hell?
Exactly. Although my first job was in poetry, which was strange enough. So I took him up on it. When I lived in New York, I lived across the street from Catch a Rising Star. And Leno would come down on weekends to play Catch a Rising Star and stay with me.
Oh, what a cool world that is. I mean, that just to be able to see all those comics and the primordial ooze of their careers.
Yeah, it was. And I didn't realize it at the time. I don't know what I was thinking at the time because I also had an opportunity. There was two people that I knew when I was young, and both became megastars. I thought I would somehow have some name recognition by the time I got somewhere. But I went to high school with Bruce Springsteen.
Wow.
And used to make little films with Springsteen. There was three of us. One guy shot the film. I wrote these little scenarios, and Springsteen would come over and play, and we'd record him on a guitar, a reel-to-reel tape recorder, just as a musical little backdrop for these 16-millimeter films. So I was still in touch with Springsteen, who gave me the rights to do a screenplay based on Darkness on the Edge of Town.
Oh, nice.
So, and I'm ready to go out to L.A., and Leno's saying, come out, stay with me for a few weeks till you find a place, and get into cable TV is coming on big. And I thought, why not? I've always wanted to go to L.A. I've always had wanderlust. So I left New York and came to L.A. and went to work for both magazines and in television.
Did you stay with Jay?
I did stay with him for the first few weeks until I found an apartment in West Hollywood.
And what happened to the Springsteen project?
The Springsteen project got picked up by a company called Charles Freeze Productions. Chuck Freeze was a big distributor and producer at the time. And I believe he must have made an offer to Springsteen that really turned him off because the project just went south right after that.
Wow.
So Playboy had written it up for their coming attractions on their coming attractions page. It was getting publicity. And I think Springsteen was really wary of L.A. at the time. He had gotten married, I think, to an actress on one of the soap operas. Yes.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
That didn't work out. So it was a really unusual time for him. I think he was a bit of a fish out of water.
He had that, right around Born in the USA, he got very showbizified for a bit, and then you could see him sort of retreat from that.
Exactly.
You could tell the stylists were creeping into his life and everything.
Yeah, and he went back to Freehold, New Jersey, and I stayed in L.A.
Yeah.
So
it's weird because you're not a show busy guy. You could have respected whatever he wanted in that project.
Well, absolutely I could have. And going back a few years earlier from that, while this is the same time I'm working at the New Yorker and Esquire, I got approached by, I think it was Pocket Books, and they wanted to do a biography of Springsteen. And they had heard from an editor that I had known him since childhood. And they approached me to write the biography. I'm working as the assistant poetry editor at the New Yorker. This is during Watergate, and people from the New York Times are coming into the editorial library where I'm working, and they're discussing Watergate, and I'm just marveling at all this stuff. And I'm thinking, I think I'm 21 years old. Do I want to write a biography of a rock and roll star who's only about 23 or 24 at the time? No, I don't want to do that. No, as much as I love Springsteen's work, and I really hold him in high regard, and I turned it down. Of course, Dave Marsh from Rolling Stone went on to write the book, make a lot of money, and it was a major career mistake. Probably should have done it.
Yeah. I still don't think you were wrong. I really don't. Creatively, all you could do is write a Springsteen song, basically.
Yeah, right. Right.
To romanticize that many years.
True.
That time had to be exciting.
It was.
So you're working at the New Yorker doing their poetry stuff?
Yeah.
They still have poetry in the New Yorker.
Very much. Yeah, part of the job was picking out poems, being a first reader for the poems, and also to help with the anthology that they were putting together. And I had studied with a number of poets in residence at Emerson and BU and at Harvard, and had won something called the New England Short Story Award that was given out by the poet at University of Massachusetts was the judge that year. I had been sent over to the New Yorker after getting a job interview at Backpacker magazine. And I had written something up. They liked me. They couldn't use it. And he said, my wife works at the New Yorker. Why don't you head over there? You can get in there by the typing pool. That's the entryway. I failed the typing test. Fortunately, on this little resume I had typed up, I had put in this New England Short Story Award and the poetry background, and the poet, Howard Moss, who was the poetry editor at the time, saw it and said, I want you. And I got saved from the typing pool. So the job was to assist him and also to write up précis of everything that was in the magazine, whether it was Letter from Paris or a profile or even the captions to the cartoons. They would write up 3 different versions of what that meant on 3x5 cards that went into a big file cabinet. So whenever a writer was assigned a new assignment and they had done something, say it was on Bastille Day, they would come down to this editorial library, pull out the cards, and see what had been done before. So it was a great way to start off a career.
Sure. So you had to take in everything in the magazine and then write up a summary of everything.
Absolutely everything.
God, that's wild. So you're super connected at the beginning of your career with the written word and with written journalism in all of these different forms, as you say, the New York Times, and they were breaking stories, right? The Watergate stories being led by print journalists at the Washington Post. And as you watch what's happened to print journalism and sort of how it's now all digital, I mean, of course, this is like, light years later, I understand. But is there a marginalized aspect to written journalism? It is being lost in the general stuff that's out there, blogs, Medium, some of which is really good, Or is it actually enjoying a little bit of a renaissance because some of the investigative stuff that's being done and other is being led again by those in the written world?
That's very true. There is a vanguard of several magazines, the New Yorker, Atlantic, obviously in newspapers, the Washington Post and the New York Times, certainly other outlets, Axios and Politico and Slate, all do something that we all had to do with the New Yorker as part of the job as well, which was fact-checking. And fact-checking 9 ways to Sunday to make sure that absolutely every word was correct, that every pronoun was correct, that every verb was in the right tense. So when people rail now about fake news, and they'll say something about the New York Times or in the New Yorker, this was obviously fake. And this comes up at big family gatherings where some rogue member of the family, whose politics I don't quite agree with, will come up and say fake news. And that'll start me almost on a rant of explaining to them what the New York Times reporter goes through to verify unnamed sources. Those unnamed sources are not fake news. They're checked out 8 or 9 different ways at least. So it's an education that I think people need and certainly aren't going to get across the country to be able to differentiate between what's fake and what isn't. So in that area, yeah, it's really current and it really hits today's news.
It's a code of professional conduct almost, of journalistic conduct. This is the way you do a story, vet a story, double check. I think that sense of how thorough things are oftentimes in many of these publications is lost in the rhetoric of both sides.
Definitely.
Well, and it's lost in the format of the internet, I think, too, because I think it is, it's so easy to trick people into the visual cues of what news looks like and believing that that's from one of those credible sources. It's when everything is coming through the same speaker, it tends to sound the same. And I think that's been one of the constantly degrading factors since the internet became widespread. I think is that people's critical thinking skills when it comes to sources of anything have deteriorated so badly.
People's skills have deteriorated, and it's become so cynical from the other side. I was recently approached to write fake news, I thought the guy was kidding.
Is it called Fake News, the publication?
Well, these are various websites. I had gotten a message via LinkedIn from a psychologist. And I looked up the guy, and he said, I'm interested in you doing some writing work for us. And I looked him up, and he was the head of a tele-mental health unit. Man with a PhD, a psychologist. I thought he must be interested in me writing some stuff about psychology, because I had, at the time, just finished a piece for UCLA magazine on brain mapping. And I've also profiled a number of psychologists and psychiatrists there. So I was sure that he was getting in touch with me about that. And when I spoke to him, he said, no, it's not about that. We're starting out a fake news operation for various websites. And I said, you want to run that by me one more time? And he said, yeah. He said, you really don't have to work very hard. You can just make it up. Just make up whatever. And I said, like what? And he brought up the incident a couple years ago at the pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. that was alleged to have some kind of child molestation thing and linked to Hillary Clinton. And the guy showed up with a gun. It was just insane.
Yeah, the whole child porn ring that was
sick, just
completely
really
fictitious.
Sick.
Yeah.
I said, well, tell me a little bit more about this. I'm intrigued, not so much to do it, but I want to know a little bit more about this operation. And he said that there's a group of technicians he has in Egypt that are very adept at putting fake news onto various websites that are read by 30 million, he claimed, supporters of Donald Trump that like to look at these websites and get their kicks on some outrageous headline. And then the ads appear there. So the ads were doing very well in getting response from these readers. I said, let me get this straight. I write fake news here, and then technicians in Egypt put it up on the internet. He said, that's right. He said, we need you to start it off, because once you start it off, we'd like you to go to Macedonia. Now I'm really intrigued. What does Macedonia have to do with all of this? Well, there are other technicians in Macedonia that have figured out an algorithm for searching the internet in English to put together certain words that would be the headlines of these fake news items on these websites. We'd like you to oversee that operation. I asked him what his politics were, and he said, well, I'd rather not discuss my politics, but he said, I can tell you my wife wants to kill me. He did not want him to be doing this. I certainly didn't do it, and I approached the guy and said, I would be interested in this whole operation if we could do this as a documentary for Vice on exposing the whole fake news operation. But I think it's probably a dangerous area.
Yeah, I think it is a dangerous area.
But isn't it interesting that he identified this from the professional vantage point of having a psychiatric background or background in psychiatry?
Yeah. And it turned out he had been a psychologist at Corcoran State Prison dealing with Charles Manson.
Wow, that's just...
So I had said to him, I don't know if I don't think I'm going to take your offer, but I might want you for an interview subject on the documentary.
Right. That's eerie how it all came around.
Very eerie.
You mentioned the brain mapping. You did a lot of work in this area with these people who are working on a research project at UCLA associated with brain mapping.
Yeah, they have a place called the Amundsen Lovelace Brain Mapping Center at UCLA. So it's a full-time thing, and they are mapping the neural map and the way that the genomes were mapped. So they hope to have a full mapping of how the brain works, how neurons shoot off, and the analogy to it is like airplanes in the sky going from hub to hub, so that United would fly, I don't know what their base is, at Houston or Dallas, wherever, they would fly there, and then other feeder lines would go out. And the neural network works very much like that. So we're just at the cutting edge of what results going to be, and it'll have an impact on Parkinson's and a lot of diseases. One thing that they've initially just established is the link between food in your stomach, in your intestinal tract, and brain function. So what you actually eat does affect how you actually think. And it's just on the frontier of this whole area, but it is quite fascinating.
That's astounding. I don't see how you follow that trail back to your intestines.
Right? Yeah.
That's wild.
It's a chemical effect when certain food's being digested, and they'll send a signal back up to the brain, and it can affect your mood.
Sure.
And it's what it portends is
Proves
revolutionary.
That Mark and I think very differently.
There is that.
Well, all of these things, and they're so unrelated and yet related, because you always think of the term "it takes a village." It's always on a positive kind of thing. So it takes a village to bring up a kid right, or to And it's also taking a village to put out fake news. If they're going from America to Egypt to Macedonia.
It takes a Manson family.
Yeah, right? Yeah. Real or assembled.
Yes.
Did you have something to do with the Johnny Cash, Richard Nixon? You and I talked about some connection between Johnny Cash and Richard Nixon.
Right. I can talk to that a bit because I'm under a non-disclosure. But I can tell you this, which is this will be out on Netflix this summer, and it's a series called Remastered. What it does is look at the intersection of art and politics in various cases. And this is a case story of Johnny Cash and Richard Nixon and where they came together. I can tell you that it was in, I believe, 1970, and Johnny Cash was invited to do a White House concert. At the time Woodstock had happened, Nixon had been elected, but not by as huge an amount that he wanted. And he was already looking at re-election in 74, and this is early on. He wanted to enlist Cash's help, and he wanted Cash on his side. And Cash had always been basically non-political. And he asked him to sing Okie from Muskogee and Welfare Cadillac. Cash answers, those aren't my songs. They weren't really his politics either. He said, but I will come and sing a few gospel songs, maybe something new that I've written. Great, he comes. And he puts his year-old baby to sleep in the Lincoln bedroom. He proceeds to play some gospel. Nixon's enjoying it. And then he broke out a song called What is Truth, which he had recently written. And it was an anti-war song, anti-Vietnam. If it wasn't anti, it was certainly questioning, because he said kids had come up to him, college kids, saying, what is truth? We can't believe what we're reading in the papers. Are we actually bombing in Cambodia? There had been rumors to it, but he had not announced the Cambodian incursion. And Johnson had obviously lied, and Westmoreland had lied about our involvement. So he wrote this song. Nixon apparently was appalled that he'd be singing this song, but he was in a fix. What are you going to do? The kid's sleeping in the Lincoln bedroom. You're already playing. What am I going to do about it? You're here for the weekend. So it takes that moment in time and pulls back to show how very soon afterwards was Cambodia, was Kent State, was a whole series, and then leading to Watergate.
Yeah, yeah. The country was really...
James Brown aligned himself with Nixon.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. And
interesting alliance.
Because James Brown went to the White House and performed, or you're saying...
No, he actually aligned himself politically and sort of stumped for Nixon in a lot of ways.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, I do know that I think there was a CNN documentary on fairly recently that talked about James Brown singing I'm Black and I'm Proud, which was a huge moment in history at that time to embrace that idea.
Right.
And he had been one who he'd stopped straightening his hair, and he went back into a natural state, sang that, and that was huge politically.
Well, the Black Pride movement was huge at the time. It was an explosion, right, of black rights. And then it sounds like you guys know this better than I do, but they're the things that can be traced back probably to that Black Pride.
Yeah, and the Panthers coming out.
Right, and the Panthers, exactly. And a lot of that used by those who were racist elements in the country and also opposed to the Panthers or viewed the Panthers as a seditious sort of element. And they sort of weaponized who the Panthers were and even members of the Panthers, right?
They did, and the Panthers did an incredible amount of social welfare.
Right.
They set up schools and food banks and just did a tremendous amount of work for the community, which they don't get credit for.
Sure, and there'd be those who'd say, yeah, but they also were behind violence against cops and all of these things that were...
Well, they were on a parallel path with all people. It's Reverend Jim Jones, who had started out also doing this in Indiana through his church and food banks and social welfare programs, and look where he wound up. So
yeah.
That convergence of wanting to do the right thing and then giving into darker forces is more prevalent than we'd like to admit.
Yeah, narcissism and charity aren't always a good mix.
No.
Because there has to be a thank you.
So, you touch so many different bases. I'm wanting to, not leave any that might really be...
I want to touch ghost-based. I want to go back to ghost-based. Okay. Has your opinion on the supernatural changed in doing all these shows?
Yes and no. One of the things I had, projects I took with me from New York to L.A. when I moved, I was fascinated by the story of a guy named Edgar Cayce. Edgar Cayce was known as the sleeping prophet. From the early 1900s to the 20s.
It's C-A-Y-C-E?
Yes.
Okay.
And he was fascinating because not only did he talk about Atlantis and the Bermuda Triangle, ancient Egypt, but also a lot of medical remedies, which a lot of them were borne out. He was fascinating because he just didn't say this stuff and then people enlarged it or rumored and things got twisted. He would have a stenographer come in and sit down while he went into a trance, and she recorded absolutely every word he said, so it was all documented. Almost in the way that Comey documented all of his stuff on memos immediately afterwards. Casey made sure he did that. So I didn't know how to do anything in television. I had written magazine pieces, and I'd written newspaper articles, and I'd published poetry, but I didn't know from television. So I put together what I thought was an outline for a mini-series based on the life of Edgar Cayce. That was also in my friend's mind when he got the Ghost Show, this production company, and said, yeah, I remember him with Casey. He's into all of this stuff. So I went into it with an open mind, not really believing so much in ghosts, but that if 2% of the world or 1% of what they were saying about the paranormal was true, it would change everything. I had worked while I was in school at a place called the Ishii Research Center in Cambridge, Massachusetts. This was a crazy wild professor who was dealing with some people from UCLA, Thelma Moss, and this was on biofeedback and how to use the mind to channel your thought, your alpha waves and your beta waves and your theta waves. It was used to, they thought, would be a great adjunct to medicine so that you could get yourself in a resting state and deal with pain management and that type of thing. So I've always been fascinated by it. The ghosts were almost like a sideline to it, and I was more interested in the history behind some of these stories because for every ghost story, there's really a story of history behind it, whether it was a murder or a personal haunting from something that actually happened in history. So I concentrated in that area and realized there was a niche in that. So I've gone on to do quite a few shows, produced or wrote or both, mostly for Travel Channel, but I created my own series called Haunted Highway, which ran on Sci-Fi for a couple of years, and it was Jack Osborne, Ozzy Osbourne's kid, was the host of it, the prime host of it. And this was on Native American myths, which, again, I always tried to bring it more into the academic area. So it was the skinwalker idea from the Navajo. It was the Wendigo from the Iroquois. And, that lore and legend and mythology is what fascinates me the most. I've never seen a ghost. I haven't been touched by one. I did get freaked out by one psychic.
What was that?
Well, we were shooting an episode of the allegedly haunted Egyptian theater in Boise, Idaho. And there's a fellow that...
What did they allege happened? In other words, why did they tag it as haunted?
That if I'm recalling this correctly, it was the fellow who screens the films, is up in the booth.
Projectionist guy?
Yeah, the projectionist died there. I can't remember if it was a murder or he jumped from it, but he died. And his spirit is supposedly seen at the theater. And it's visually an interesting place. And I love Boise. I'd never been there before. So I'm at the location and I'm interviewing various people from the theater manager, people who have attended screenings there, people who knew the story, local historians. One of the people is a local psychic. And as I'm interviewing him, he says, I just want to tell you that your father's passed, but he's here today and he's very proud of you. And I kind of... passing over it because I'm on a roll here. I've got certain things, in TV, obviously, and a lot of other things. Time is money, and there's a whole crew shooting. We've got deadlines. I go by it. I could hear snickers from the
I've got
crew.
A supernatural shot list here.
Right. The crew is thinking to themselves, I could tell, this guy's just trying to gain favor with the producer. And we continued talking. He said, he's here, and he just, he thinks really very highly of what you're doing. He's not quite sure why you're not doing your journalism as much. Now it's starting to almost annoy me. We get done with it, and we wrap up, and he walks over to me, and he said, look, there's one other thing I want to tell you about your dad. He's very concerned that there's someone who is either your sister or very much like your sister. She's had a stroke recently, and he's concerned about her. So when you get back to the East Coast, please go visit her and try to take care of her. I basically lost it because 2 weeks before that, a first cousin of mine, who was very much like my sister, had a stroke and was in that situation. Wow. So I walked around Boise after that shoot like in another altered state of my own, just a bit out of it, which I've never experienced before or since.
Wow.
So If there is 0.5%, 0.05% of any of this being real, it does change things. And is there something to it? There's something to twinning. There was a special on recently about twins separated at birth, and, they're both hockey coaches. They're both married to women named Mary. They both brush their teeth with the same toothpaste, and their kids do this. It's more. How do these things happen? Is it nature versus nurture? Well, no, that was the question, actually, of this documentary. No, it was nature. But what is that nature? We've got a lot to learn.
Yeah, the journalism thing you kind of see as a bluff potentially early, because you could easily be a producer who, and you can just get from you that you're an erudite guy and maybe journalism was your thing. You know what I mean? In other words, I'm not going to give him a lot of credit for that. As it turns out, maybe it came from a place that was completely authentic, but I'm just saying if you wanted to be too super cynical about it, you could be. But the second play, which is about, as you say, about a family member and the stroke, that's a home run.
That was a home run. And it viscerally affected me.
Sure.
It wasn't that, I'm going to think about this now and be spooked by it. It was just instantaneous. I walked around in a daze for several hours, and it's stuck with me since. It's like, okay, I can't knock it all. I can't poke holes in it. So when I deal with some of these locations that I look at for future episodes of Ghost Adventures, and they ask me if I believe, and I always keep a very open mind, because people... It's like a religion. People believe in it. You've got to have that willing suspension of disbelief.
I was on a show called Encounters. It was a show on Fox, just like your show, in the sense that it explored various ghost legends, sightings, UFO stuff. So it was paranormal that probably extended beyond like just the ghost world. So from that standpoint, it wasn't like your show. Anyway, they sent me to Graceland, to Memphis, because there was the story that had come in that Elvis had a best friend. I think his name was Gary something. He was in a wheelchair. That's the only other specific I remember. And oddly, I don't remember anything about the house being wheelchair accessible, but maybe the lady who had purchased it had gotten rid of all that stuff. But anyway, this is what I recall. That, first of all, it was right by Graceland. So it wasn't really, you couldn't go in. The shoot took all morning, all afternoon, and all night. Never got to Graceland. All I wanted to do was get to Graceland while I was there, and I couldn't. But the house was a very modest house, almost like a guest house on the property of Graceland. But again, not technically on the property. He had purchased it for his best friend. Blah, blah, blah. Three things. One is that one of the French doors, that she had these French doors to the living room, was cracked, and it was cracked with all these super small fissures. She claimed that those fissures organized themselves into the image of Elvis with a cape and kind of a side profile. And I could kind of see it. And of course, on the show, we drew it out and all that sort of thing graphically in post-production. And then she claimed that when she'd go to sleep at night, the radio in the living room would all of a sudden come on to an AM radio station playing an Elvis song, which was pretty weird. That's definitely up there as weird. But again, I don't know if any of this is true. This is what she claimed, although she seemed quite sincere. But I'm sure she'd been telling that, if you will, story for a long time, and maybe you start to believe it. And lastly, and perhaps most interestingly, she claimed that she would regularly go to bed, fall asleep, and the toilet seat, she's lived a single woman, was always down. But when she'd wake up in the morning, oftentimes it would be up. And she claimed that was the ghost of Elvis relieving himself in the bathroom.
Still some earthly delights.
That's right.
Yeah. It seemed, again, right, like I didn't query her as to why would a ghost need to use the bathroom.
Right.
And of all the signals, that seems like sort of an odd one. But we, of course, did recreation on the toilet seat going back up. Yeah. In the small bathroom, we're all crowded in there. Some of us are standing in the shower, in the tub, and, with lighting and all this stuff. And it was, we've been, I think it was I want to say 11 hours we'd been there at that point. And I did at one point just lose it. Start laughing. I stepped out so she didn't see it, but it was so absurd so as to really press the limits of, come on, guys.
Right.
Whereas your show is a little more grounded in, as you say, sort of myth, story.
Your show sounds terrible, let me just say.
Well, certainly the way I'm telling it back, it was terrible. I think they actually made that, a halfway decent offering. But
right. Well, I have to say Ghost Adventures, to their credit, if they say there was a serial murderer that lived there, which might have been the reason for the hauntings later on, there has to have been a serial murder there. We won't go by hearsay or by what the former resident said or even the neighbors. I've got to find it in the paper or check out with the police department. So they do a pretty decent degree of fact-checking on that show. The rest, who the hell knows?
There are multiple seasons, as you say. You've been doing that or some version of that for a long time. That's a lot of stories, a lot of paranormal, a lot of unexplained events.
Which makes it harder and harder to find new locations because they don't make them anymore.
Right. The one place that I ever had a sort of sense of ghosts was at Little Bighorn.
Mm-hmm.
Driving through, it wasn't even like part of the park tour. I just was, as a comic, as a teenager, I was driving through Little Bighorn National Monument or whatever it was, and I felt a true sense of supernatural. And I later, like years later, saw a news segment about the park, and there was like this Indian guy going, this is a very spiritual place, and things are very close to the surface here, And I was like, yeah, they are.
That in Gettysburg, because Gettysburg has got incredible reports and histories and amazing people who have verified that they felt a spirit there.
The casualties associated with the Civil War were so enormous. I think we often lose track of just how many people died.
And how ugly they died.
That's exactly right. There was blood everywhere, and even those makeshift hospitals, of which there were many, that were soaked with blood.
Every wound became infected, and
I shot in one of these places about a year ago. I had developed a show with combat veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan. There are 4 or 5 of them at the time, including the woman who ran it was a combat medic, graduate of UCLA, history major. She went into the Army, became a combat medic. They came back from Afghanistan and Iraq with tremendous PTSD. And they're in the area around Fort Campbell, Kentucky. They're on the Tennessee side of the river. Clarksville, which is the basis for Last Train to Clarksville, the Monkey Song, which is about the troops coming in and out at the train station there. So I developed a ghost show for them because they got together, not having served with each other overseas, but with PTSD. And how do we combat that? Well, one of the biggest ways to combat that was their sense of camaraderie. And they could reform that by being a group going ghost hunting on a Friday night at military places. So we went, I thought, I think I have the makings of a show. She was quite a personality. The other guys, terrific people. And we went and we filmed them at a place called Ripa Villa Plantation outside of Nashville. And this served as a Civil War hospital and a headquarters for both the Union Army and the Confederate Army at different times. Wow. And that's with blood stained on the floor, and the spirit of soldiers. And did I see one? No, but did they detect stuff that we couldn't explain? Yeah, and these people were more into debunking than proving that there's a ghost. So it's quite interesting. And the sociological angle of that show was what intrigued me, which was these are combat vets that are helping each other with a major problem by doing something like ghost hunting.
That's a terrific story, that just the community associated with everybody's shared experience, it almost doesn't matter what the endeavor is.
Exactly.
It's just getting them together. And I'm sure that this is done in veterans hospitals and in different organized ways. But the notion that by sharing your experience with others and resharing it, and somehow you can begin to defang it a little bit, to take the toxicity and bleed it out. Wow, that's really significant. And here, not to be too literary or heavy about it, but in a way, those ghosts are real ghosts. You talk about being haunted by something. That PTSD, the haunting of war, and those images and those experiences, that is a real ghost that those people go through every night when they try to fall asleep without medicine or with medicine or however they do it with hypnosis. I mean, the heaviness of their haunting is beyond the worst kind of horror film sometimes.
Yeah, they have their feet in both worlds, the other world and the terra firma of the world that they're part of now. But it helps them cope with their families, with their wives, with life back in the United States in a non-combat situation. So it's remarkable. Unfortunately, it was too real and too heavy in that sense for television that wanted cheaper thrills and more scares.
And resolution.
Yeah.
Every week,
No. When you're doing the ghost photography or when you're doing any of that, do you use that? Is that Kirlian photography still out there, or the infrared something where you shoot this stuff and oh my God, I just saw a little girl in a nightie in the hallway?
Right.
Is that stuff? What's the state of the art on that?
I
stuff?
do recall the Kirlian cameras because I had one way back decades ago.
Yeah, so early on. Tell everybody what that was.
Yeah, that was to shoot the aura. Supposedly, any living thing gave off some sort of electrical energy, which we do, but whether it actually forms an aura or not, it's pretty much debunked. Now they use Fluor, which is like heat-sensitive kind of cameras, so they can pick up they'll show you a shot, various shows, of something flying over a mountain, and it's a heat signature. And you wonder, what the hell is it? There's really something there. It could be a colony of bats or mosquitoes or skinwalkers. Do we know? No, we don't know. Mm-hmm. But you can see when you get into the Badlands of Dakota or up in the Four Corners area, which I've shot at a lot, you can see why people start to believe these things.
Absolutely.
They're isolated. The geography lends itself to it. The darkness, the incredible constellations that you see up in the sky, and then the mythology from the Native Americans. We put that all together. Yeah, I could be a believer there too. If I hadn't seen New York and Los Angeles, then
sure. I was just watching a thing, and I spent a lot of time. I grew up in Minnesota, and I started my comedy career in the Midwest. So I would, as a teen, I'd be driving across the Dakotas for a gig, and Montana, and all these places, and the sort of depth of aloneness one feels in that landscape. And I just saw a thing about Teddy Roosevelt, who spent formative years in like northern North Dakota. He talks about it. It's like more, you feel more alone than even in the middle of the ocean, essentially there. And I would, I would tend to believe that just there's almost a desire for there to be something else, for you to not be so alone.
Exactly, not alone. And it's quasi-religious in that sense because if you follow the idea that some have about God, that man was made in God's image or God made in man's image so that we're not alone. All of that, I think, is on the similar plane.
I think so, too. I think it's a biological need almost.
Yeah, on that biological need, there was an article in the New York Times Magazine cover story. You can go back and actually find it. It's called Darwin's God. And it talks about the evolutionary need for creating an order out of things that you can't understand. And that's just a log line on it. But it is how we are built evolutionarily to create God or create some spiritual order or a way to explain so much that is inexplicable. Right. So it's called Darwin's God. I recommend it. It's a really great piece. I remember reading it, and now it's been a few years, but it's still out there, and it's excellent. But it's to your point, which is that we're wired to create something.
There's a line of poetry that I think speaks to this, and I believe the name of the poem, this is not exact, but it's close. It's about the invention of zero. And it says that the man who first saw nothing drew a circle around it, which always blew me away because there is something that isn't there. But if we draw something around it, it suddenly has a form. Right. And, whether that's God
but still no value.
Physical. Right. Right. It is a placeholder, though.
Yeah. You deal, it's interesting, in your world, in all the different worlds that you have feet in, you do deal with a lot of these concepts that, you have to begin to explore. Sometimes it's in a superficial commercial way, and sometimes it's in a deeper way. But really, it's really exciting stuff. Will you come back and visit us again?
I would love to.
If people want to reach Robin Keats, you have an email or something where they can send you their ghost sightings?
Yeah, absolutely. You can send it to rkeats1, that's RKEATS, with the number 1 at gmail.com.
rkeats, KEATS 1 at gmail.com. Robin Keats, thank you. You can reach J. Elvis Weinstein at J. Elvis Weinstein on Twitter.
True.
And you can reach us here on this show at edgewithmarkthompson at gmail.com. Thanks again, Robin.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the show. So great that you stuck around and heard what I thought was a really cool conversation with Robin, and of course, always a good conversation with Michael. Until next time, bye-bye.
Hey, everybody, why don't you do me a favor and like The Edge with Mark Thompson on Facebook? Yeah, that's going to bring in the kids.
Get more of The Edge on Stitcher and iTunes, or go to our website, edge-show.com.